That's a little better. Going live. Commercial. Don't know if we're going to get anybody here today. Hello, anyone who's going to be watching this later. Just nice greetings. We'll see if anybody shows up here. Just to sort of say this is my experiment at trying to do something sort of scheduled just a few hours before, so no one really had any planning ability, but to do a live chat with viewers who may be interested in World War II tank techs and other tank topics. Tank topics could be a cool title for this instead of tank tech talk. That would be cool. I may want to get this and edit this down a little bit at some point. Hey Django, good to see you here. One of the things I have gotten rather frustrated with sort of started with the Total War series, because several people were sort of pushing me to play that and going, oh, it's fully compatible with Hearts of Iron. Hey Mikhail, good to see you too. That Total War is fully compatible with Hearts of Iron 4 1.4.2. Well, it ain't. And because Black Ice does not at all claim to be compatible with 0.2. They only claim to be compatible with 0.1. Now, and when I asked over at the Kaiserreich forum, after I also noticed this similar sort of bug, just sort of chatting here for a minute to see if anybody else is going to show up sort of for the beginning of this. But what version is it? Oh, it's always the latest version of Hearts of Iron. Well, that's 1.4.2. Well, both of these mods have a bug, a problem, that very much may not be their fault, but that whenever you load a game in Hearts of Iron 4, you automatically, or they automatically send home the volunteers that you sent overseas. So there's this bug, and I reverted back to the 1.4.1, and that bug doesn't happen. So something changed with Hearts of Iron 4 between the two hot fixes. I don't know what it is. I will say I have asked competent authority and have not gotten a reply back. So this is sort of stalled me. Do I play Hearts of Iron 4 with excuse me, with 1.4.1 and have some of the not so good AI stuff going on, or do I try to, because I really want to make a long series game, get through to something in Hearts of Iron 4, not just play 10 episodes and then restart again, or do I just play it without having the volunteers work? Right, and so I just don't know, and so I'm sort of stuck as to what to do with that, and so there hasn't been much of that, and I've sort of put the Kaiserreich series on hold. So I was wondering what to do today. So, because Django asked if I was going to be streaming anything today, and I was sort of planning on streaming something. So that's sort of what's happening with that. Now, so I thought that, sort of based off of chatting with Django, last weekend on Barbarossa and some of the equipment and stuff. I thought I would talk a bit about tanks because I really love tanks, and I have this really great medium here of to be able to look at tanks and talk about them at the same time. And tanks are a game changer when it comes to warfare. They really have become that. And I know a lot of sort of modern theorists, and there was a sort of the Rumsfeld push within the U.S. Department of Defense to basically discontinue tanks. They wanted an air mobile force so they were going to do Stryker vehicles, and that's why if you look at the Stryker, it's has a lot of sort of armor techs on it that are trying to be lightweight but sort of be tankish but without quite going for it. Well, I think what the invasion of Iraq, both invasions of Iraq by the U.S., and even the later counterinsurgency war has shown that heavy armor still very much has a place in warfare today. Now, I'm sort of starting here with the Panzer II, but, and you guys, if you have any questions, please just ask them. You got to sort of understand what a tank is for. And it really wasn't, well, the people who really sort of first understood what the tank was for, to a point, also did a miserable job at first making a tank. And you sort of have to understand some basic elements of war. Now, I've never been in a war, but I've studied war. The main thing that causes victory or defeat is a morale situation. Most of the time, you don't kill large numbers of your enemy. Unless I'm looking at through the history of warfare. Most of the time is you kill somewhere between, I would say, 5 and 20% of your enemies, or, you know, and one side or the other gives up. And that's sort of, rarely do you see combat casualties greater than 20% in any battle. Now, often in campaigns it may be higher, but a lot of that historically has been down to disease or other sort of wounds that are festering after a while. But the decision points, the main battles, are normally a morale-breaking situation. Hearts of Iron sort of kind of does this. Other games like Strategic Command does not do this so well. They're sort of fixated on the casualty things. Now, the reason why I say some of the people that really understood what tanks were for first were the Germans. And they understood this in World War I, but they implemented it incredibly badly in World War I. They understood what the tank did on the battlefield. It simply caused terror. The Germans' soldiers got to the point of tanks showing up on the battlefield that were fairly pathetic tanks, to be quite honest. And it just changed the situation on the battlefield radically, and the German soldiers just felt panic and terror. So that's what a tank is for. And that's sort of why I'm starting with this thing, because if you had a Panzer IV coming towards you, Panzer II coming towards you, depending on the situation, you might or might not be afraid. But, and I say might, you know, do you have a good entrenchment, or are you in a good building? Can you deal with the tank? Now, if you're just out in the open field somewhere, let's get down sort of to man height on this. That's still a pretty scary thing coming at you. It can crush you. But 20 or 30 Panzer IIs coming at you. I'm talking even to like this very day. If you have 30 Panzer IIs coming at a platoon of infantrymen, just driving at you as fast as basically they can, that's going to be terrifying. And if there's like 20 or 30 of them, and you don't have, super long range to start engaging them, I don't care how good most platoons, even in the modern, 2017, most platoons anti-tank capabilities are today, you're not going to knock out 20 or 30 of them before those tracks are rolling over you. It just isn't going to happen. So that's why this, in my opinion, is an effective vehicle throughout World War II. But why was it stopped being used? Which I find, and I hope you find this somewhat interesting. Now there's two issues here. One, stop being used, and the other is stop being produced. Stop being produced because you had better things to produce. Stop being used is a different issue. So I would say that to keep that mass going, and even in the face of the T-34, I would not in any way advocating having 30 of these guys out there moving around, but having 30 tanks and some of them being Panzer IIs would be quite effective. So that's just sort of the basic premise, that you start out with the Panzer II, something simple, basic, of that, and it's just an effective vehicle in creating terror. Now, that can be done with basically any sort of tractor, any sort of big heavy object rolling towards people. What makes one tank more effective, less effective than other tanks? And I would put that as the ability to command and control the vehicle, and the sort of knowing what's going on around it, and the ability to fight the vehicle. And so those are sort of the two basic elements to the vehicle. Now, we generally see, well, let's move up to the change vehicle here. We have the, let's do this. Yeah, tank crew accommodations. That is basically sort of, to a degree, what I'm getting at is with the ability to fight the vehicle. This is sort of the, and it happened before the start of World War II, sort of the height of optimum crew accommodations, but also the optimum crew fighting ability. Start getting any more than this, you start having coordination problems. And communication problems. So this is a, just so everybody can see, of course, is a Panzer IV. This is with some minor changes here. This is the model that started in the war, and in 1939. Again, very, very minor things, maybe with some of the earlier models. So the Germans got this right here, and their key element I know many of you already know this. Their key element is this guy here. This guy here. He has, well, maybe a multiplicity of things to do, but he has one basic job, and that is to command this unit of the tank, and that's all he does. He, he needs to keep aware of where friendly tanks are, where friendly infantry are, where the enemy is, where, all that stuff. He needs to sort of keep all that going, and then tell the other people their goals and objectives. Tell this guy, the driver, where to go, and that kind of thing. He needs to tell the gunner, now this guy down here, seated guy, the gunner what to shoot at. And the gunner has sort of two options here. Now you have this other guy down here. Oh, well, this guy's here. His only real job is to load the guns and keep them loaded so they fire. This guy here has sort of a dual purpose job. With the Germans, he's a radio operator as well as a machine gunner. And that machine gunner is still fairly important because you got to remember back to the terror element, is simply periodically him firing bursts out in the frontal arc of the gun suppresses and terrorizes the enemy. Basically keeps them from sticking their heads up, if you will. And so you need a mass effect. So this is sort of the optimum element here. And we can talk about crew fatigue, crew claustrophobic or abilities to move around in vehicles, and that's important for long term. But this is the optimum element. But this is not, and this is where the Germans sort of got to before the war started. So they were able to get there. Now, one of the reasons that sort of inspired this was looking at, well, it was actually the T-35, but this will do. This is the Czech 38T. This is, in some ways, a typical interwar tank. Just so everybody can see it. Nice snow white camouflage here. This is a Czech tank. Now, this has a different philosophy behind it. It does not have the same philosophy that the Germans had. This is the Czechs. This, one of the reasons the Germans kept it around in essence through to the end of the war, is because this was a really easy, sweet driving tank. And they kept it, the last sort of versions were the Hetzer vehicle. But I don't know if you could easily tell what the main killing thing is, and I've sort of only intuitively figured it out here with this tank. This machine gunner down here has a limited fire arc. It's good sort of suppressive capability. He can also sort of run the radio. The Czechs were fairly smart in that they knew they needed radios. So that's sort of this guy's job. You might think that this 37mm gun is the main purpose for this tank. Well, it isn't. Because this guy here is not the gunner that they're labeling with. This guy here is the tank commander. He really sits up here and looks around and sees what's going on. He's looking around and seeing, sort of what's out there, what's going on. And he then needs to go from there to then sort of lower himself down and look through the gun sights. You might think that that's sort of incredibly slow sort of procedure doing. In a way, it sort of combines the elements of the commander knows exactly where he wants to lay the main gun. Yes, and that's a sort of, instead of trying to communicate that to somebody else, the tank over, get the guy over on your right where, and trying to communicate over the radio where the enemy is that he's spotted that's only half seen. This is, in theory, the tank commander knowing where he's going to want to lay the gun So he drops down and starts moving the gun through it. But this guy here called the loader, and he is the loader for this main gun. But he has another, and I think the primary purpose here is he has this machine gun. This machine gun on this tank here is not a coaxial machine gun. This machine gun here does not move and is not targeted like it is on a Sherman or on a Panzer IV in tandem or along with the main gun. The gunner, commander gunner, does not have the ability to fire this machine gun. This is in a ball mount here, basically the same mount as down here in the hole. So it's independently aimed machine gun. And so this is where I sort of came up with this without having read any theories on it. Is why they designed this vehicle this way. This is what they think is going to do most of the damage. The commander is going to be driving around, keeping track of where his buddy tanks are, so that no one's getting separated from the rest of the tank platoon, tank company. And he's gonna, that's what the vehicle, because the driver can't see where the other tanks are. So he's going to keep track of where the other tanks are, and if he's the platoon commander, he's going to sort of, keep track of, sort of command the group. That's what he's going to be doing. This guy over here is going to, and I think either person has reasonable access to turning the turret in here. So this guy, the quote-unquote loader, he's going to keep the turret. He's going to move the turret towards whatever enemy it is, and fire the machine gun at the infantry or the enemy machine gun nest, or other sorts of things. He's going to fire that machine gun, and that machine gun is going to do the main sort of killing terror job, in that it's going to be reaching out and doing the damage. It's only when either a particularly hard to get enemy position, concrete bunker, somebody in a more substantial building, because I don't know if you guys know this, but most houses, at least in America, because obviously you can go in other parts of the world and they have stone houses or whatever, but most houses in America, these sort of World War II rifle caliber bullets will go inside of the house, go through the wall from one side of the house and out the other and keep on going. They have tremendous amount of penetration. So unless you're in a building and have 3 or 4 layers of sandbags thick, turn that building into a bunker, just being in a building, most plaster and wood and whatever. Again, if you're getting into a proper sort of stone building, that's a change. But this guy, this machine gun is just going to go through a lot of obstacles and go through multiple inches of sandbags. Meaning, if you just have your normal sort of, or what people sort of see as like a brick layering of sandbags, just one sandbag deep, those bullets are going to go right on through. You're going to need about 3 or 4 depth of sandbags to keep a German rifle round from going through them to the other side. So the main killing object here was this. This was if there's a substantial building, or if we encounter an enemy tank, he's going to get on that main gun. So this is an interesting philosophy in using the vehicle here. I do see a few people have left because this isn't interesting enough. Sorry about that. And we can look at the armor here in these early tanks. It was meant to stop an anti-tank rifle type round. It was not really meant to stop one of these main guns, because you're looking at a mass effect use of tanks. You wanted to keep them mobile, so you didn't want to overly weigh them down so that you can't get across terrain. I mean, they obviously knew the idea of, oh, we can make a super thick armor that something isn't going to penetrate, but that was counterproductive. And if you look at armored warfare, it is counterproductive. You don't really want to just, I don't even want to play to these things, but we're just going to preview this. This is an incredibly ineffective vehicle. This is just a sort of mobile pillbox, because this, in a way, is not going to create terror because it's just too slow. It just doesn't move. You just don't have that fear factor, because it just sort of sits there. You can sneak up on this thing, if you will. It's it just isn't going to do it. Now, this needs to be surrounded by infantrymen and all these other supporting elements. Well, like I say, they're just going to come up on it and pour gasoline on, on the engine compartment and light it on fire. And, not much else you're going to do, because this is going to move at like max speed 22 11 miles an hour. Yeah, in good conditions. So they understood that when they were building these types of vehicles. Now, once you got into, and I wish we had French tanks here because those are god-awful and fun to talk about. Once you get into those things, you can see how badly not to design a tank. Let's not Tetrarch. Let's look at this guy. Yeah. Now here we go. This is sort of coming off of an interwar tank, and sort of shows that basic element of not trying to build a tank to be, it's only, against enemy armor, it's only 14 millimeters thick. And, well, what is the, okay, this is the 40 millimeter 2-pounder gun. That gun's going to go, you're putting a gun on it that's going to go right through your own armor. You're not thinking that it's history of the Tabk tank. Yeah, that's sort of interesting. I don't know a lot specifically about the Tabk. It comes off of the actually much more numerous Mark VI Vickers light tank that we don't have an image here, and it's sort of in a way to well, it is a replacement for it in that it's a super light scouting tank. And this, again, it shows the British viewpoint here is that they realized you needed 2 people in the turret. One to command the vehicle, and the other here is, well, they're calling it a loader. They're really gonna, I guess they're doing a commander gunner situation, but this tank, I do believe, because again, I'm not an expert on the Tabk, this is a proper coaxial gun, meaning where you point the main gun, the machine gun fires, unlike the Czech tank. So it, the other guy is just a loader. He doesn't have any other duties. There. And then the driver. Yeah, you always have to have a driver. But it keeps it small, keeps it fast. And this comes with the philosophy of reconnaissance and not a... What about the Vickers Medium Mark II specifically? Because you're talking about, do we even have one here? You're talking about the Crusader? That's a cavalry tank, as the British would look at it. That, you see, you're getting into the again, the optimum sort of German developed. Okay, we'll go back, cancel this, and we'll go back to the Germans. Okay, in this tank here, this machine gun here, is in a ball mount. So where you point the turret, not the gun, not the main gun, where you point the turret, this will obviously face in that direction, but you have a movement arc left and right as well, just as much as you have down here in the hull mount, Django. So each of these, because can we push in here? Yeah, this is a ball mount in there. It's similar. It's a little different, but it's similar to this mounting in here. And so, well, I think we can see it. But let's go change vehicle. We see it better here. Yeah, this is showing up a little better. You can sort of see that this is a ball mounting here, similar to this ball mounting here. And so in the game, it's you point with the same thing. But this machine gun does not have the gunner here, the commander gunner here, does not have the ability to fire the machine gun. We can get to the Panzerjäger one. So he can independently target this within a firing arc. Okay, so you see that. And so it's similar to the machine gun that's down here, in that the driver has to point the main tank in more or less the right direction, but up and down and left and right within there, these both have a similar sort of mounting thing that they point. So it's a different sort of command thing. And now the Panzerjäger 1. This gets into a combination of things that the Germans were doing here, and you can see later also in the Martyr series. They encountered particularly the Char-B and the Matilda II, and they were not penetratable by the German 37mm gun. And they knew some of this before the invasion of France. So they had the Panzer I. The Panzer I was never meant to be a combat vehicle. But from its very early days, it was put into combat in the Spanish Civil War. It continued basically in frontline service until the invasion of Russia and the Barbarossa. And it goes back to what I was saying before some of you showed up. The tank's main function was to create terror in the enemy, and since it had 2 machine guns, it was quite terrible to uh-oh. Are we back? Okay. It was quite terrible to just your standard infantry, but it was becoming less and less effective, and they needed the ability to knock out heavier tanks. So they got the beautiful, the Czechs, just before the Czech Republic collapsed. No, maybe, yeah, right in about 38, I think it was, right before that was collapsing. The Czechs developed this really beautiful 47mm anti-tank gun, and that's what you see mounted in here. And I mean, they've done a really nice job with the graphics on this. Now, as you can sort of see that they even have the gun shield here that was sort of the basic standard gun shield. Don't know that they really have any of the proper trail, but it actually had 2 sort of funky wagon wheel type wooden wagon wheels on it. But otherwise, it was probably the most modern in 1938 developed anti-tank gun. And that the top thing here is a recoil buffer. It's not a machine gun or any other sort of thing. It's a recoil buffer to help deal with the recoil in the ground mount, but they put it in here. So they had these that they captured, and they produced some bit more. And they put them in the Panzer I because it was becoming less useful, but they needed a vehicle to be able to transport these effectively with the rest of the army unit. So they just basically took the turret off, opened the hole up, and you get yourself a really nice tank destroying gun that, until it encountered the T-34, and it was doing pretty good. The Matildas on the front probably wouldn't get through, but it would definitely have taken out a Char-B. So it was probably one of the best, well, it's the best Czech anti-tank gun. Would have made a great tank gun if the Czechs had lasted. And so they used these for a few years, but it really wouldn't stand up against the T-34. Just a basic, your two-man, we can throw on the X-ray element here. Two-man in the gun with a driver operation here. And it functioned very well for what it was meant. And the Germans, they did a very, German production never met goals. Germany was just quite god-awfully unprepared for World War II. For going in for a world war against just about everybody else, they were very unprepared, particularly in the production capabilities. So there was they eventually stopped making Panzer I drive systems. They kept the Panzer II drive systems in production until the end of the war. I don't have one here. Those are the Czech ones. And the drive systems became the Marder IIs with their PaK 40 75mm guns. Oh yes. That they did as well as they did without being prepared is incredible. And so they kept the Panzer II drive system in production with the Marder IIs until the end of the war, and the Wasp. I don't think we have one here either. The 105mm howitzer. Those were basically the two versions they kept with the Panzer II up until the end of the war, until 1945. That was in production. They kept the Czech tanks in production here. We'll choose a cruiser. We'll take a look at this. This is the conversion model here. This is converting a 38T with a Russian 76.2mm general purpose gun. It was a general purpose, not both a anti-tank or a field piece that they mounted on it, still maintaining the earlier lower hull with the machine gun on it. They kept this in production, and they were pretty smart about it, because you can see here quickly, these guys are sort of half-assed riding up here. These guys are all right functioning down here, but it's not that good. So they upgraded that. Is this the right one? No. Yeah, that's the one I want. Who do I work on? I thought I already got somebody. Yeah, here we go. Somebody trained up on it. This, they did a much better job. Now this has the PaK 40 Yeah, you're right. There is no Marder 2, unfortunately. Well, it depends on yeah, some of them were. I have seen it pictured with the Czech, the ZB-26, the magazine fed gun. This on the 3 here is the Czech belt fed machine gun. I forget the exact number of it. But this is when they converted over to a, once they had got it into production of the PAC 40 75mm gun. Ah, true. Customize. That's a good point. But then I want to show you which. Oh, we don't need to do that. Let's. The next stage here of the Marder 3. Do they have it? No, they don't. Unless it's over here. Nope, they don't have the purpose-built Marder 3. I wanted to show you that. Well, I can quickly explain. What they did do is they moved the engine from back here up to the front and then moved the gun mounting back here, and they made both a PAC 40 type version of the gun and a infantry gun version of it, the 105mm. Similar to this guy. We're just going to preview this. This is based on the Panzer II bolt, and they mounted this gun on it. This was, they put this new in the game here. I haven't grinded one up yet, got one yet, but this was a very limited production. I think like 24 of them. It has an extra road wheel, so they had to elongate the whole hull, and for the special production, and because they were to be able to keep it so low profile. And I think all of them went to North Africa, I think. And this is with the infantry gun. And so they kept we're just canceling this, get out of this. The Czech tank in production to the end, and then they canceled all of the we're just going to preview this. All of the other uses for it to make the Hetzer. So Germany's inability to produce enough tanks, they kept this pre-war 1938, early 39 design. They were just getting it ready when Czechoslovakia collapsed in 39, all the way until the end. And so they made this guy is a beautiful little piece of improvisation, because a decent armor, low profile, effective gun, but it was an incredibly cramped and very hard to function in vehicle here. So you have your gunner, your commander, your loader, and your driver. So very, very cramped, very small. A remotely operated machine gun. Yes. Yeah. That infantry gun definitely used down in North Africa. So you have this tendency developing with Germany improvising, upgunning tanks to meet, because everything is relative, because a Panzer II can shoot just as much enemy armor in 1939 as it can in 1945. It just armor gets thicker. And as I was saying earlier, the Panzer II is still useful in 1945, not to kill a T-34, but to kill a half-track. You got a half-track full of infantrymen. You show up with that 20-millimeter gun, you're going to go inside and out the other of a half-track with that 20-millimeter gun. It's going to be just that effective. But they run into, and I want this version. We're just going to see, customize. Well, yeah, let us get into this without choosing the group. This vehicle here. This vehicle has just a 2-man turret and becomes the Soviet Union's mass production. Yeah, I'd love more viewers. So I'm glad you guys are asking questions, because it keeps me figuring out what you want to hear about. And so this guy here isn't the wonder tank that this one. I'm not talking about all versions. This isn't the wonder tank that it becomes. This is just a barely functional vehicle, quite honestly. It has enough armor, because when the Germans first encountered this, you got to realize the primary tank the Germans were using was just becoming the Panzer III. The Su-76 is all right, but we'll get to that in a bit. So this guy was just very functional, but the Germans had the really great ergonomics, really great crew accommodations. Panzer III was just becoming the main use, because if you look at 1940 and the invasion of France, most of the German tanks were Panzer I's and Panzer II's. And to make up enough medium tanks to even sort of function, they had to use a lot of the Czech 35Ts and 38Ts. So they were just now getting, in 1941 in the invasion of Russia, enough Panzer III's. But that Panzer III only had the 37-millimeter gun. And that 37-millimeter gun just isn't going to deal effectively at any sort of decent ranges with this sort of armor. But this tank really sort of sucked in the other ways. Most of the models did not have a radio, so it could not communicate. One of these, I think it's this hatch on the turret here, or on the thing, was this little hatch here. Was a little hatch you'd open up inside to wave a flag out of while keeping it open, so that you could communicate one or more flags, so that you can communicate to your other tanks in the platoon. Now imagine driving around in a tank, and you're in one of these, and somebody's trying to tell you something by waving a flag out a little hole. And so this guy here, presumably the gunner / commander, needs to be looking out of this side optics all the time at the tank next to him to get his orders from his platoon commander. The platoon commander may have a radio receiver in the tank, meaning he can listen to somebody else speak on the radio, maybe. Company commanders are the guys who had a duplex, being able to both broadcast and receive communications. Okay, so and now you could maybe point to some guards unit or some other unit that gets radios throughout it, but most of the tank units did not have radios down to the individual tank level. So they were using flag communications or hand-waving gestures, because this is loud, noisy. So if you can roll along and have your turret hatch open and the commander sort of out and looking around, they can sort of keep track with each other. But this just sucks. This is not the wonder tank that people talk about. before invading the Soviet Union, the British, the Germans were already fighting the British, and the British were getting heavier tanks. So they had started to develop and put the short-barreled 50mm gun on tanks. But even that still is not effective against this armor very much. And let's go back. But the Soviets then come to, or as time goes on here, and it's actually a different, I think there's 3 factories that are, oh, I don't want to do that. Let's preview it. There are three factories that are producing it. One of the factories starts producing this tank with this turret. This is still a 2-man turret, but it is much more livable, much more capable of loading and firing the gun. Then they get no, keep hitting the wrong thing. Sorry, let's go back. Then they get to this guy here, and I think it's one of the other factories. They start putting this guy here, and so now we're starting to get into a decent tank turret. Down on the bottom here, it's staying the same functionally. Not that there's not any changes. It's just a driver and a machine gunner. They're doing their job. They're driving, they're machine gunning. They're being reasonably effective. And this and the one I just showed previous are the main T-34s that are used through the war. This is what's facing the Germans. This is why the Germans do so well. Because, again, Soviet radio production just never is effective enough. They just never have enough radios to put them in the tanks. So you're still not able to communicate well. So you're driving around the Russian steppe or forests or whatever, and you're a platoon or a company of these guys, and just one of the tank guys has his head out, one of the tank commanders has his head out and sees an enemy tank somewhere, or a group of them. How the hell is he, unless he's the platoon or company commander, how the hell is he going to communicate this? Start waving his hands? Yes. I mean, that's what he's going to do. Start pointing over in the other direction, and what are you pointing at? And just where, and trying to, and while all that's going on, the Germans, somebody spotted the Soviet tanks. The Germans are on the radios giving out good range estimations, because if you play this game well, which I don't, you get good range, fall of shot in it. So if you know that they're at 2,000 yards, with good targeting sites, where to click up on the ranging things, because if you don't, the Soviet optics were pretty poor. That's another thing. They were pretty poor. So if you're just pointing down the gun at the thing and then saying, oh, you're hitting the dirt in front of them, up, higher, lower, or you think you're going over. So the Germans were able to identify, communicate where the enemy was, what the enemy was doing, able to maneuver, able to better share range findings. Yes. Oh, turret basket, that's important too. But so the coordination of the unit is, and so by the time often the Soviets are, they're learning that the enemy is there by being hit by the enemy. Now, because of the fairly good armor, they can withstand some hits. And, once a friendly tank or two next to you starts blowing up, you start realizing that the enemy is there. So the overall numbers that the Soviets were able to manufacture made up for the combat losses. Hey, Nagaro. Good to see you. Good to have you here. So production kept the thing going, kept them compared to the Germans. Now, where you really get into what is, and it's really only in the last stages of the war, the 57 was a very limited production, is this guy. This is the one that people ooh and ah about, and is so great. But I think, and if somebody wants to correct me, I think it's like in 44 when this finally really shows up in any sort of numbers. And so you're looking fairly late in it. And now we're into a 3-man turret. This is where you're finally really getting into the situation that's really good. It has the 85mm gun on it, and that gun, short of a Tiger, can take out about any German armor. Yeah. So it can take out, at any range that the Soviets are going to be able to effectively hit the enemy. They're going to be able to take it out with that 85mm gun, except for, like I say, a Tiger or something really heavy. They finally now have, with a 3-man turret, the ability to load fast. You now have a dedicated person to observing what's going on. I do believe they were still having radio numbers problems, but I'm sure they were trying to do that. So this sort of becomes the thing that everyone thinks about when they think about T-34s. And this, by this point, you still have the deficits of it, like as Django says, lack of a turret basket, lack of radios, lack of good optics. It's not a comfortable tank to drive around in for hours at a time. It's not a comfortable tank to live in. It's, in some ways that's still against it. But it's now become, with enough production numbers, the thing that can deal with just about everything but the sort of heaviest of German armor. And so this finally pushes Germany over the edge, because you got to realize, what's Germany trying to do to be able to deal with these things? They're trying to make a Panzer II, with a Pak 40 put on it, with no real armor, as its tank killing. Just a Pak 40 that's mobile. That's how they're trying to deal with this thing, and they're just not keeping up with that. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have America. Now, they faced the same obstacles. Well, fuel tanks, whenever you get hit, catch on fire. Explode, that's, gasoline doesn't explode. A tank round hitting a tank going inside is an explosion, and then adding more fire to it is, and that fire being spread around, depending on where it is, can be awfully burning to flesh inside of it, but in and of itself it doesn't explode. The Germans basically had a rule: if your tank is on fire, you can get out of it. Until your tank was on fire, you couldn't get out. The night Triever, sorry if I'm butchering your name. Hello. We're talking tanks here, and my thoughts on them, and you guys are very much allowed to ask questions. So on the other side of the Atlantic, you have the U.S. The U.S. had several design philosophies different than the Germans. The U.S. came into the war late, because obviously they got in after the Soviets. So they did have the coming off the experience of what had sort of gone before without putting units into combat. But they had one sort of, I sort of want to say, bad design philosophies, and I will say for America, an unnecessary design philosophy. Hey Cosby, good to see you. Oh yes, but not as it's not as bad as some might think. It definitely was more vulnerable than some. But the big thing with the U.S. is they did not change models or make improvements very much. I mean, they obviously did, and we're going to get into some of that here. But they didn't. They were extremely reluctant to make any changes. Basically, the U.S. philosophy, and this was more than just tanks, they wanted to turn on production and turn it up to max and just max out and produce. The U.S. production system is the most effective in getting production out there of World War II. And it was the Americans. Oh, Night Reaver. Okay. Thanks for breaking that up. Now I understand that better. Sorry. Some of the GM production specialists during the Depression were contracted to go over to the Soviet Union to help build tractor factories. So the Soviets were using the American style of production. Some of their facilities were basically built and designed by Americans. Built as the labor was Soviet labor, but the sort of design staff for setting up the factories were American. So the Soviets and the Americans basically worked off the same basic principles. So when the feedback that did happen in the American system from combat was slow and very reluctant to be added into production, where the Germans were just the opposite. They were constantly getting combat feedback and constantly tinkering with the design, to the point oh, we've just completed 20 tanks. Oh, you have a new tweak to it? Let's send those 20 tanks back in to do a little tweak to it when they needed to produce more. And it's one thing to add in a new improvement as they come down the thing. It's another thing to sort of delay tanks, to send them back to the factories to have tweaks, like a tweak to the vision block or something like that. But you got to sort of understand that when you're looking at the American tanks. Now I'm going to sort of wanted to talk about the Grant and Lee, and we can, but I think since we're all talking about the Sherman, let's sort of preview that here. This is sort of the base model of the Sherman. Now, even when we talk about wanting to produce or not make too many changes, the Sherman was produced in more than one factory, and they started out being produced in more than one factory, and so they had different production techniques. This here is a cast hole Sherman. This whole hole is a casting. Obviously you can see it riveted together with some other pieces. The turret is a casting. I want to see if they, quite honestly, I haven't ground up many American tanks, so I'm not familiar with. Okay, yeah, here's let's preview this. This is a welded hole Sherman. Functionally, they're basically the same. They have basically the same engine. Work the same. These are sort of early tanks. Now, as you say, you're saying that they're easy to kill. Well, that's not quite true. They're easier to kill than a T-34 because they have thinner armor than a T-34. But I wouldn't put them any easier really to kill than a Panzer IV. So you got to compare what are you comparing it to? You know, and it's that sort of kind of setup. I think it's basically if tanks that got knocked out, I think for every tank knocked out, I think the number was, I'm trying to remember here, 1.6 crewmen were killed. That's pretty good. And so that if you have a tank that's knocked out and more than half of your crews are getting out, because again it's a 5-man tank. So see, the Americans had by the time they got this, they had learned what they needed to make a good tank. So you have this. Now there's some problems with this, and one thing that the Americans didn't do so well was crew accessibility. It has these two fairly small hatches here for your gunner, your bow gunner, and your driver. But it only has one hatch on the turret. Now, if you look at something like the Czech tanks, or a Panzer II, they also only have one hatch, but they're a little sort of tiny, small turret. They had plenty of room for a second turret here. I mean, second hatch. And so you have the situation of the loader has to enter through here before these other two guys, because you can't climb over these other two guys. Get in first and then climb under the gun and up into here to get it here. And so when your tank is on fire and you're talking about hitting the ammo or hitting the fuel tanks, catching on fire is when, oops, we're on fire. He has to wait for these two guys to get out that hatch and then go under, and of course hopefully the gun isn't pointed up too much, so get under and out here. And so that was sort of a bad design feature. And the Americans realized it through feedback very quickly, but they did not change this configuration. It was the British who changed the configuration, and then they simply by cutting holes, let's see if this has, simply by cutting holes in the top of the turret. Yeah, so this is what that is a hatch, and that was eventually added to late production. So it took a long time. And they also finally opened these hatches up larger too, so that they can get out quicker. So now you finally have a pretty good crew accessibility. And it's also important to, like, you're hanging out and there's the enemy coming, so everybody get in your tanks and get going, as well as what we were talking about before with dealing with the Soviets were so bad at is, knowing that the enemy was attacked, or spotting the enemy, where the Germans were really good, by being able to have the loader have his head out, because hey, if you're not shooting at anybody and you already have a round in chamber, the loader has nothing really to do. So when you're not actively seeing, oh, there's the enemy, he can open his hatch and look out too, and he can be looking around more than just through the little vision block here, or the sort of pistol port type vision block out here. So he can be out and looking around to see where threats are, and you really increase your combat ability by doing that, by seeing that. This is why, and I'm not disagreeing that these tanks aren't vulnerable, but they were very effective fighting machines because they were incredibly reliable. The Soviets got lots and lots of these Shermans, of sort of the earlier types than this one, and they really liked them, but they didn't use them in combat. You may think that's sort of odd. Well, let's pull up one of these. Just change a different view here. More of these types of models. They got lots of these guys. What they used them for was training vehicles. This was, I think, one of the first two hatchers. They used them as training vehicles because the T-34 was designed for the combat that they expected. I think it's, I don't know, 30 hours or something like that of combat or something a tank was supposed to last, or on average last. So the Germans did the thing of making the tank quality to be able to last 30 years or something. And it's only going to last, oh no, not 30 hours, 30 minutes in combat. That's it, 30 minutes. It's something like 30 minutes. Tanks last like 30 minutes in combat. The Germans produced tanks that were a quality to be good and last for a long time. Well, the Soviets produced tanks to last 30 minutes in combat. But if you're going to drive tanks around a lot to learn, that doesn't do so well. Yeah. So that's why the Soviets used the Shermans as training vehicles, because they're automotively were very long lasting. They weren't nearly the precise engine setup that the Germans had, but they were much better training. So you very rarely see photos, for two reasons, of Shermans or other American tanks in Soviet service. One, for propaganda. They didn't want to admit to the world how much help they were getting outside of it. And two, mostly they used their own tanks because they wanted to use the Shermans for training purposes. But so get back to the Americans. So the Americans have these tanks that are very effective. Do we have a jumbo here? Just no, not that. Don't know that we have a jumbo. I'll just show that off because jumbos are sort of cool. Is this a jumbo? No, we don't have a jumbo here. So the Americans have these tanks that get back to what I was saying earlier on, those who weren't here. A tank is used to create terror on the enemy in combat, to affect the morale of the enemy. So the American tanks, yes, they don't have very good armor protection. And they are slow to upgrade their guns, because getting back to the idea, the Americans are very slow to make changes to their tanks. They do over time, and we can see, and I'm not in any way denying all these different models. It's just the speed at which they were coming at was fairly slow. So, but as time goes on, this gun here with a 76 millimeter gun, and it's not so much that it's one more millimeter than the 75. It's the shell is much longer. The powder behind it is much longer. And Sherman's used in the battle for Caucasus in London. Okay, good to know there, Mikhail. Yeah, I knew they used them at some points, but I rarely see actual photos of them. Okay, the middle lane. Cool. Let me see. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I keep thinking I was going to shut them down. So I'm in the preview mode. Oh, come on. Middle lane. No, that ain't it for sure. Oh yeah, there it is. So we'll get to this in a second, the jumbo. You can sort of see what I want to talk about here. So that they have a tank that can kill, as it goes on, they're slow to do it, but can kill most of the German tanks. The Panther has fairly weak side armor, but what is really good about these tanks, they all have radios. American radios are the best radios in the war overall. They're integrated into a system, and tanks aren't standing alone. That's one thing, sort of getting back to it. With warfare, there's lots of combined elements. We all talk about how you know, the Blitzkrieg and all that. It's, you know, it's air power, it's infantry, it's tanks, it's armored infantry, it's, you know, it's all elements of it. So the Americans, they have the walkie-talkie, but most people mistake what it is. The walkie-talkie actually was a backpack radio. They also had a smaller handheld radio that you see in the movies, that's sort of a large banana shape, so that they know where the enemy is much of the time. Obviously there's ambushes, it happens, but that even when there's ambushes, they get on the radio, they start communicating, they find out where the enemy is, and you have one of the most maneuverable tanks out there. The Sherman is, for its power weight ratios, are really good. They can go over most of the terrain, and so they can outdo the Germans, they can outmaneuver them, and they have much greater numbers. So that, you know, would I rather, you know, on a one-on-one tank duel, would I rather be in a Panther, one that's running well, versus a Sherman? I'd probably rather be in a Panther, but I'd much rather have the 30 Shermans than the 6 Panthers or whatever equivalent. So with balancing out the combat forces, the Shermans are getting the job done. Now, and the reason I wanted to get to this is you talk about the Sherman being easily to penetrate. Well, you can sort of see it here. What they did with the Jumbo is that they realized, just what you're saying, that these tanks are fairly vulnerable. But if they stuck on some extra armor, an extra layer of armor, they sort of set these guys up as not scouts, but as lead tank elements. And they were meant to be the tank, or 2 or 3 tanks out in front, driving down the road or whatever, and that they were going to get hit by enemy anti-tank weapons. And they were trying to make cruise survivability be the thing, not tank killing ability. So this has your standard 75mm gun on it. It doesn't have, you know, an upgun vehicle. Even when they were making upgun vehicles, it was just meant to be the tank that was out there in front to take the hits. Yes, I'm sure if you were to put a one of the 88mm gun of the Tiger II, which is the more powerful of the 2 88mm guns, and fire that at it, you're going to go through this thing. I just doubt that, you know, because there should be, well, it's more than that. Well, you see here, that's your heavier armor, but there's supposed to be 2 layers here. Maybe it's not either showing up or what, I don't know. Because that's either got to be a display. Okay, there. Yeah, see, there's the 65mm or 63mm and the 38mm double sort of layer there. You can see that there, and then you can see on the side. So, but even that, your better 88s are going to go through it. But your Pak 40s, not that they can't, but you're much more likely to survive. So they realize it. So the Americans are dealing with the situation as they're finding it, a bit slowly, again, on the change thing. And so they sort of come out, in my opinion, with sort of the perfect balance between the 2 extremes of the Germans' high-tech solutions and the Soviets' attempt at pure mass production solutions at fighting. The Americans are sort of right in that sweet spot, and so that they look to do that and come up with some very good tank situations. These are just one thing I think is an interesting thing, and I do want to touch on it briefly. Let's just click over to this. This is the M3 medium tank. Churchill started calling it the Lee, and the name sort of stuck in British service. This was done because they couldn't build a turret immediately in the late 1940, very early 1941 period. That yeah, it's somewhat of a hideous monster that would house the 75mm gun that the British wanted to be able to combat the German tanks, and the British just wanted a tank now. So they built the gun in the 75mm Sponson. The Americans liked machine guns on their tanks because they realized the sort of lesson of the terror tank. And because you can look at some of the earlier models, they got machine guns everywhere. This guy sort of does too. This is a 7-man tank if you don't realize it. They're only showing 6 here, but there was a 7th guy right down in here to operate these machine guns. And these machine guns are actually silly. They have no real way of being aimed and hardly anything. So Americans quickly discontinued that. The British used this, but they saw that it was a bit tall, as Django says, a hideous monster. And the British, oh well, and this guy down here, let's get back to this guy that's not here is supposed to be the radio operator, because in the American versions, there was a radio down in here. The British thought the person who should operate the radio should be the tank commander. So they had a new turret put on here, and I don't think we have a Grant. No, we don't have. No, I don't want to cancel that. I was trying to get to. No, we don't have a Grant. The British have a Grant? No, the British don't have the Grant. Okay. The Grant is let's go back to is basically the same but with a different turret, and it had an elongation back here that housed the radio. Oh, okay. Well, that'd be cool. That's probably why I don't have it. I've heard, Mikhail, that it was a grave for 7 brothers. At least that's what I've heard. But that the Russians called this vehicle a grave for 7 brothers, because to have for the Americans to have the tank radio operation, you needed the 7th person. But yeah, that would work too. Grave for 6 people. And so the British, and they got rid of this top turret here. This is just a stopgap measure. It worked fairly well, but it doesn't get to what the sort of essence of what they sort of knew that they needed to do. And I find this a cool tank, but it's sort of a god-awful mess. You know, you got the second loader here for this thing, and it's big, and it gets back to what pre-war tanks, large tanks, weren't. They didn't think in the terms so much of these guns. They thought in the terms of these guns and then lots of auxiliary turrets to cause that terror on the battlefield. Let's go to the. But what they quickly found was big heavy tanks that don't have heavy armor are quickly dead. You know, things like this. The Soviets also loved things like this. If you were to try to armor this up, you know, to a heavy, thick armor standards, you're not going to be able to move. But as a infantry killing device, you know, all those turrets on it, it sort of kind of works, but not so well, and it's obviously sort of overbuilt and stupid and whatever else. But this is sort of the world that the grant was coming out of. And sets that up. Let's see. We need North Korean tanks. Well, what kind of tanks do you think the North Koreans have? Basically, they have either Soviet or Chinese tanks. Mentioning North Korea, and this could turn out, and North Korea could theoretically turn into a world war. North Korea could be the new. Oh yeah, no, it's too long. It doesn't work right, but it's just sort of a infantry killing device. Lots of machine guns. People are talking about how terrible and dangerous the North Korean army is. I have not seen one good analysis of North Korea and of the North Korean army and what's going to go on. All the reports I see, they talk about however many thousands of artillery tubes pointed at Seoul. And I'm deviating from the topic of this thing briefly here. If we let North Korea to really become, because they have nuclear weapons, but really become a nuclear power, really do that, I think it's going to be very, very bad. I don't know. I don't want war in Korea, but I think it's the better alternative to letting the North Koreans really get nukes and have lots of nukes. Because even if the North Koreans won't do anything with them, they'll sell them to somebody who will. So, and I have not seen any good analysis of how well trained or how well motivated the North Korean army is to actually fight. I don't know how new their artillery is. Because if you have 1970s artillery in caves or whatever, does any of it still even work? I mean, literally work. And so numbers aren't very impressive to me. And the U.S. with their satellites, we can plot the location of all the artillery, and we can target it with, artillery and all kinds of other things. But we can target it with that big Moab that they dropped in Afghanistan. If you saw the devastation, that'll seal up most of the entrances to caves that effectively. When you say North Korean tanks are good, what tanks? What one? Yeah, old war equipment is very good if it's kept operational. What makes you think the North Koreans are doing good maintenance on their stuff? Their country's incredibly poor. I'm not saying they're not, but what information do you have that you think they're doing good maintenance? That's sort of my point. And so we could crater out a lot of their abilities. And also, if we were to get that the Soviet or the Russian TOS system, the TOS, the sort of flamethrower that they sort of think of it as artillery system, those rockets that you can target caves with will just burn out all the oxygen out of those caves, killing all the people inside of it. So, I'm not saying that the North Korean army sucks and is no good, but I've not seen a good analysis of it. I've just not seen anyone come out with any good reports of maintenance levels of, what kind of soldiers do they have? I presume they're draftees. How long are they drafted for? Are you in the army for 6 months or 6 years? And that matters. And so, if we're looking at so if we're looking at that kind of thing, the North Korean army just sort of becomes a target, because you can look at the great and powerful and scary Iraq army that we killed back in the 1990s that basically wanted to surrender on sight to us. That I remember all the reports as we were getting ready to go in, Operation Desert Storm, and they just all surrendered and just ran away. And then when George Bush the younger went in, the army had prepared the army that was going to be so fearsome had prepared to evaporate and turn into a guerrilla warfare army. And I remember all the reports from military experts, former generals and stuff being on, well, city fighting is just going to take huge, cost huge numbers of casualties, and those cities are just going to become death traps. What? No, they didn't. We took all the cities easy. What came was the sort of ongoing insurgency warfare that the Iraqis fought. That's an entirely different thing. So these same people are telling us how terrible the North Korean army is. I just no longer trust it. I'm not saying they're wrong. I just don't think they have good information. Yeah, and so if you're talking about the North Korean army, let's just say it's in the state of, let's even be generous, 1970 Soviet army. What do you think the modern American army would do to, yes, we target their nukes. We just hit every single nuke location. We fly satellites and reconnaissance aircraft over them and use various sniffing things to sniff out the location of nuclear weapons, and we just target them. You don't need to target them with nuclear weapons themselves. You can target them with various other stuff, and you just hit them from the air. I think we just overrun them. Yeah, they're T-55, T-72. So that's what I'm saying is if we were talking about, let's take the best East German-based Soviet divisions, because that's where the Soviets put their best units in East Germany. Those were sort of full-time professional soldiers. Their conscripts call up, 90-day wonders or whatever. We're back deep in Moscow area. They put their best stuff in, because I was alive back then. I know some of you are old too, but I was alive back in the days of the Soviet Union. And I talked to people that were having to prepare to fight them. They knew that the units that were initially staged in East Germany were really good. What would the modern U.S. Army do against that force, the 1970s force? They'd eat it up. It would just be, yeah. This is because I think the scenario here's my future scenario. If we do nothing, if we continue what the U.S. has done, sanctions and talking and UN resolutions, North Korea will continue to develop its missiles. North Korea will continue to develop its nukes. It will reliably get a nuke that can put on a missile. Well, yeah, what is China going to do? But so once they get these missiles, once they get reliable nukes, what is China going to do? Are they going to invade North Korea if North Korea has a bunch of nuclear missiles that they'll fire at Peking or Beijing? I don't think so. And so once they have good intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have a bunch of them, not just 2 or 3, but they can launch a bunch, 10, 20 missiles all at once. What are they going to say to the U.S.? Here's what I bet you they're going to say to the U.S. You withdraw your forces from South Korea, or we'll launch. And I bet you, if they wait to a nice democratic president in there, they will withdraw the U.S. troops in South Korea. So now South Korea, who has no nuclear weapons, is facing a nuclear-armed North that has a large army. What do you want to bet then that North Korea invades South Korea and takes that? And what do you want to bet if they're still under lots of sanctions that North Korea, if they have some really nice nuclear missiles, they're not going to sell them to Iran or some other terroristic type nation to use, or just sell some bombs that you can put into a cargo container that you can put on a freighter and move it into New York Harbor and blow it up. I think the world will be a lot more a deadly place if we let North Korea get weapons, or really get a lot of these and continue down. So I think I think China doesn't believe we'll do anything. So well, it comes down to China. If China has been the sponsor of North Korea, and so China fears a U.S. ally sitting on its border. Well, I would do a deal with China to say, hey, we'll withdraw all of our troops from South Korea, and maybe even remove the air bases and everything, remove everything from South Korea, if you remove North Korea. You got to remove North Korea first and have a unified Korea, but we'll leave once you have a unified Korea. But see, I think China thinks there's going to be too much chaos. But I wonder if China really thought the U.S. was going to invade. Would they think it'd be better to have the U.S. invade North Korea or to have China invade North Korea? Which do they think would be better? But see, they don't believe we would do it. But if they really believed we would do it, I think they would then do something. Because there's only bad solutions from here. I think the worst is to continue to let things happen what they're doing. But there's only bad solutions because they've let madmen have weapons. And we're going to let Iran have nukes too. But Iran, the leaders of Iran, they believe that if they start throwing nukes, it's going to be the second coming of God or Jesus or Muhammad or whatever. And they're crazy people. Well, see, North Korea, yeah, you're right. It isn't going to collapse on its own. So long as China continues to trade with them, North Korea is not going to collapse. And I just think China needs to do something about it. China needs to invade and take it over. And they can set up a new North Korea. Get rid of the Kim family, start a new, a different Kim family with no nukes. Tell them whoever the new rulers are, if you start doing nukes, we'll invade you too. They could do that. That would be my sort of solution for that. All right. Well, this was sort of my first experiment at, tank talk, tech talk, war talk. I don't know. It just didn't go. Went all right. I'm very glad you guys showed up. Really? North Korea's Air Force is good? I'm not saying it isn't. I don't know. And it hasn't been in combat since, 1950 something. So how do we know that? I mean, I'm just saying, I just don't know that. So this has been, I guess, Tank Talk. I'm really glad you guys showed up for it. If you want to do more of these, I would gladly do more, and it could be a little more structured. I could go into talking more about specific tanks or other weapon systems, but I just thought we could use this really nice features here of being able to look at tanks. Cuttlefish, a Sherman called Emcha, okay. Yeah, even the MiG-29s. We saw what happened to the Iraqi Air Force. And when Saudi fighters are able to shoot down the Iraqi Air Force basically without losses, and the Saudi fighters, even if they're using American models, they're not up to the American levels. We don't give them all the high-tech stuff, even when we sell to the Saudis. So I just don't think they have the training levels. And as I was talking with the tank stuff, it's often the people inside are more important than the technical abilities. So you show up with, you look at the Arab experience, and they would get their pilots trained in the olden days by the Soviets. And I don't know what the Soviet trainers thought of the Arab pilots that they were sending back. Whether they thought they were good or bad, I don't know. But then you look at how the Israelis would just come in and kill them. Just even in air-to-air combats. The Israelis just trained and trained and trained and were really good pilots. And so we can just see how well they're going to do. And I just can't imagine that North Korea has the money to train their pilots well. Because to train your pilots well, you have to have them fly. And to have them fly, they're going to burn up jet engines. And those are costly to constantly replace. So your 1970s, your 1980s engines will all be gone if you've been training. And you'll need to replace them multiple times over this time period. And so you just really can't think that they're going to be good. So, North Korea war scares me. It does, because I don't know what's going to happen. And lots of Koreans are going to be killed, including South Koreans, if we go to war. But I think if we go to war, nowish, would be fewer South Koreans killed than if we wait and let them have lots more nukes, and or let them take over South Korea, because trust me, the North Koreans will butcher lots of South Koreans. Okay, well, again, thank you. Thanks all for coming. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow me on Twitch, or if you're not already a subscriber over on YouTube, that's Gamer1745 on YouTube. Yeah, I'm going to be leaving. We want to. Can you, Django, PM me some other place for them? Or just message me over on YouTube or in the Paradox forum. Give me the addresses for that. There, can you do that then? Oh, well, Nidal, you sort of missed the earlier part, and you can go and rewatch it, where I was covering a lot about the German tanks early on. That's sort of where I started. So, yeah, thanks, Django. And so if you're not already subscribed to me over on YouTube, love to have all you guys. Think up of more questions. I'm going to be doing some more streaming, maybe, I don't know if today, but this weekend. Uh-oh, I gotta change the bio. Thanks, Cosby.